The civil rights community and the justice-seeking faith community has never asked for Officer Wilson to be proven guilty first. And we've never advocated for the madness of mob violence as a means to address a misguided judicial system. The question before the grand jury, and in some ways the nation, was whether or not an indictment to have the case properly adjudicated in the courts would occur. And I think it's so important. I'm glad the media is here to say that. And I see someone video it. An indictment does not mean guilt. An indictment means that what has happened needs to be handled within the confines of a court system where you can have examination and cross-examination. The DA, as all DAs, could have done that himself. Any DA has the authority to indict. I know. It's been indicted. I want to talk about what this has meant in terms of the way this case has proceeded. Now, our prayers continue to go out to the family and the friends of an 18-year-old teenager named Michael Brown. I don't care if he was 6'9", he was still an 18-year-old teenager. We see the senseless death of yet another African American at the hands of those sworn to protect and serve. The NAACP is calling on the community to act collectively, calmly, until we secure justice for the family of Michael Brown. The NAACP is advocating for new leadership of the Ferguson Police Department. And we know that justice for Brown's family and him and Ferguson community cannot be solely delivered by just the forced resignation of the police chief. The Ferguson Police Department needs not only new leadership, but new reforms to the practices and culture, which is why it's important that there's a federal investigation going on about that entire police department. The NAACP and our allies will not stand down until accountability and justice in the cases of police misconduct are served for not only Michael Brown, but many other men and women who lost their lives through such police discrimination. Killing in Missouri did not happen in a vacuum. It was a part of a sequence of tragedies that have seared the name Rodney King, Delio Oscar Grant, Jordan Davis, Eric Garner, Kia Rickaboy, and right in Charlotte last year. And the cases I have named, almost every one of them required federal investigations because the state and local investigations failed. The death of Michael Brown and the decisions of the Ferguson Police Department underscore a distressing symptom of untested and over-aggressive policing culture that has become commonplace in communities of color all across the country for too long. So we must protest with power against the abuse of power. And as we protest, we must realize, however, that more than 250,000 people descended on Washington, D.C. August 28th, the anniversary of the death of Emmett Till, August 28, 1955. That's why the March on Washington was chosen on August 28th. A lot of people don't know that. The date of the March on Washington was chosen because it was the anniversary date of the death of Emmett Till. And it was the death of Emmett Till and the acquittal of his killers that made Rosa Parks decide that she had to do something to challenge the inherent system and insidious system of Jim Crow and racism. It was the death of Teal and seeing his open casket and Mamie Teal's fateful decision to open that casket and let the world see what happens when racism goes unchecked that spawned not mob mass violence, but a modern-day civil rights movement. One writer today said, from the Boston Tea Party to the Montgomery bus boycott to the Moral Monday movement, we have proven that nonviolent, strong, consistent protest can in fact change the consciousness and the culture of a nation. All we want is justice. And we must manifest our moral outrage. This is a national issue that goes far beyond this one moment. In reality, the non-indictment of Officer Wilson is an indictment of and a charge against a system that is not willing to fully address the racial and discriminatory flaws that still exist. The non-indictment is an indictment. It is an indictment of a DA who is supposed to be two things: a seeker of the truth and an advocate for the people, as opposed to an advocate for the perpetrator. What we learned from the DA's presentation last night is that Mike Brown's family did not have an advocate in the secret rooms of the grand jury. Normally, in a case like this, the DA would ask for a particular indictment. It's almost unheard of for a DA to give something to a grand jury and not ask for a particular indictment. But when a DA simply gathers all of the information and pushes it off on the grand jury, many legal experts have said that that in itself is a kind of predetermining of the outcome, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, Alex Little, a former federal prosecutor who spent 6 years trying violent crimes, including homicide, says this. In August, he said he raised concerns about the strategy. And he said, when the district attorney says, in effect, we'll present the evidence and let the grand jury decide, that's malarkey. This is an expert. He says if he takes that approach, this is what he said in August, if he takes that approach, then he has already decided to abdicate his role in the process as an advocate for justice. At that point, there's no longer a prosecutor in the room guiding the grand jurors, and more importantly, no state official is in the room acting on behalf of the victim. The prosecutor is supposed to fight for the rights of the victim and not protect the victimized. Which is also why the National Bar Association released a statement today questioning how the grand jury, considering the evidence before them, could reach a conclusion that Darren Wilson should not be indicted, not found guilty, but just indicted, and then tried in a court of law to see whether or not guilt would be the outcome. This non-indictment is an indictment of a DA who told the rest of the nation last night, Nancy, in essence, this is what he said if you listen, that a kid, and I say kid because I got children this age, that a kid, a possible suspect in some form of a robbery, who is unarmed, is a justifiable candidate for death. That's an indictment. This non-indictment is an indictment against that kind of rationale. And you know, if anybody has ever watched Cops, you know that people do a whole lot of things and never get shot by police. Depending on what class and what color they are. Because you see, if the standard is, if you are a potential suspect in a robbery, and and that makes you a candidate for death, by that standard, no suspect would ever make it to jail. What we saw last night was an indictment of a system that still has not answered this fundamental question. Still hasn't answered. How far was Mike Brown from the officer when he was shot unarmed in the head? How far was he when all of the shooting began? After whatever happened in the car. It's an indictment of a system that admits on camera, he admitted last night, there were conflicting reports. And this is the rationale. There were conflicting reports, conflicting testimony, and because it was conflicting, that's a justification for not having an indictment. No, the conflicting reports is the justification for having an indictment. So that those conflicts can be sorted out in a court of law in public with cross-examination. Many legal experts say that in every case there are conflicting testimonies. So if that's the new standard, you would never indict anybody. That's why you have a court system. In fact, this came out today. In more than 162,500 cases prosecuted by U.S. attorneys from 2009 to 2010, grand juries voted not to return an indictment in just 11. Out of 162,000 cases, only 11 times at the federal level did grand juries not return an indictment, because an indictment does not mean guilt. This non-indictment is an indictment of a system that tolerates and perpetuates discrimination in the carrying out of the judicial mandates within our system. For instance, St. Louis County, I was there, I didn't know this, it has 90 municipalities. And in St. Louis County, they fund the government through ticketing. A major part of the government is funded through ticketing and warrants. So last year, they issued 29,072 tickets for traffic offenses. And that Florence alone collected $3 million in fines and county costs for 2013, which is 13% of the government's revenue. So the system is set up that the county can't function unless the officers are ticketing and stopping people, which only increases. And when you add racial profiling to that, the system is set up to disproportionately discriminate against and to profile the poor, brown, black, and poor whites. That's how the system helps to fund the county municipality. And in fact, I think they call it poverty ticketing. This is an indictment of the criminal justice system that refuses to deal with some very real facts. Not just in Ferguson. The fact is, racially biased police violence has become a kind of status quo. A 2012 study produced by a group called Every 36 Hours Campaign revealed that police officers, security guards, or self-appointed vigilantes killed at least 313 African Americans in the year 2012 alone. That means a black person was or is killed at the hands of law enforcement or others every 28 hours. Now, there was a time in 1909 when the NAACP was formed that every morning they hung out a flag. Another black man was lynched today. Because in 1909, black men were killed on an average of one a day. In 2014, black males are once again being killed by officers of the law or people trying to act like officers of the law on an average of 28, every 28 hours. This is an indictment of a system that has created what Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow. Today, there are more African Americans under the correctional control in prison or in jail, on probation or parole than there were enslaved in 1850. Think about that for a moment. More black men today are under the control of the correctional system than there were black men enslaved a decade before the Civil War. Millions of African Americans are now cycling in and out of prisons and jail under constant correctional control. In fact, in American major cities today, more than half of the working age African Americans in working age are either under correctional control or branded as felons. This non-indictment is an indictment of America's continual refusal to deal fully with the realities of racial discrimination and profiling in our criminal justice system. In fact, there's a book entitled, I think the name of it is God, The Incarcerated God, God of the Lockdown, where someone is asked in New York, why do you put more money in prisons than school? And the person says, that's easy. Some of us can't live like we want to live unless some people are removed from our community. So we create ghettos to put them over there so we can live like we want to over here. But then the ghettos fill up and we have to have somewhere to remove them from the ghettos so that we can refill up the ghettos. And that's why we create more prison. This non-indictment is an indictment of a system where too many in policy positions operate from the bell curve perspective. I don't know if y'all remember that book from the 1990s, which came as a racist book. Charles Murray was one of the writers of it, and another sociologist, that actually suggested in that book that you have to have an enormous amount of prisons, you have to racially profile, and there's no need to work at changing structures of communities and providing social safety net because black and brown people are genetically predisposed to criminality. And some of that same language, listen to Fox News last night, some of that same language and not so ambiguous suggestions are being made by some men. Ferguson and these folk, these boys are predisposed. In fact, earlier this year, the NAACP published a report entitled Born Suspect. The question was raised by scholars, what happens when by your very color or by your very class you are born suspect? And the report details statistically the reality of having to deal with being guilty before proven innocent just because of the accident of birth and color. And the report talks about the targeting of motorists for driving while black or brown, stopping and questioning and searching pedestrians, targeting individuals for extra screenings at airports or conducting unconstitutional and unsubstantiated surveillances of people in their homes, their places of worship, or within their communities. Born suspect. And you know, today, when the testimony of the officer was read, he basically admitted that's what he did because he says he did not know that Mike Brown was a suspect. The call did not came in, and the call when it came in didn't even describe exactly Brown. He just saw a boy walking down the street and asked him whatever he had, but he said in the report, he said he saw him walking down the street and said to him, without like, why don't you boys, and I don't know how he said it, walk on the sidewalk. Now, I've been the first. I've stood in the spot where the blood still is. And what you don't see on the TV is that street is not some wide thoroughfare. It's a small little street in a poor, impoverished community. In fact, the back door of the apartments are here, and the street is not here. Right here, all we were there. So and when we were there, what were people doing? Walking down the street, because there's really not a whole lot of, I mean, there's some sidewalk, but it's in the community. It's almost like a driveway through an apartment complex. It's not like some big thoroughfare where you have to, they don't even have the middle line, the yellow line. I mean, the truth of the matter, when we went there, that's what we did. We stood in the street. And everybody was there. It's kind of like a block party situation. So there was really no reason, because he didn't know What you doing in the middle of the street? Why don't you get over there and walk on the side? And it's not just in Ferguson. We got racial profiling in this state. Shootings by the police that are still under investigation failed. Durham, you heard me mention Charlotte. According to one study, North Carolina police are 3 times more likely to arrest African Americans for seatbelt violations and more than twice as likely to search African Americans than whites after a speeding stop. And I have a very personal story I can't even share with the media yet, but it's very close to me. We're in a state where even when the courts have said that race is used, the court said, in fact, a Republican judge said that the Racial Justice Act was constitutional. A Democratic judge said that he proved that race is still used in the application of the death penalty. And even though we have had at least 5 black men in the last few years that have been exonerated from the death row who would have been killed, murdered in our name, we still have the legislature that repealed the Racial Justice Act. This is not just about Ferguson. We don't know how many innocent people are still on death row, or how many were put there simply because of race, or if we killed, or how many we killed. What we know is we have a system, according to the courts, that still utilizes race in the application of the death penalty. This is an indictment of a system, a criminal justice system, that will do things like this. Remember the name James Johnson? I don't know if any of y'all remember the 17-year-old boy in Wilson that was accused of a murder he did not commit and was put in jail for 4 years without a trial. And it took us 2 years in the NAACP to get him out. He would have been getting capital punishment for a crime he did not commit. This is the system. You remember John McNeil? John McNeil is an African-American from Wilson who went to Georgia, who actually shot an armed intruder about 3 feet from him that really was charging him on his own property, protecting his son after firing a warning shot and backing up even though he had the gun. 2 white officers in Georgia investigated and declared it was self-defense. And 274 days after they said it was self-defense, a rogue DA prosecuted him for murder, put him in jail for life, and it took the NAACP 6 years and his wife on her deathbed. In fact, she died before John was brought home. My promise to her, her last word to me about 2 minutes before she died was, Rev Barber, will you make sure my husband gets home? And to get home, he had to plead guilty to what he had already been acquitted of, which was involuntary manslaughter, just to get out of jail, and has 14 years of probation in front of him now, even though he shot an armed intruder. This indictment, non-indictment, is an indictment on a system that just 3 months ago in August would see a black boy named Lennon Lacey hanging from a swing set in a predominantly white community in Bladenburg in a trailer park known for drug activity. And the case would be closed, suggesting that this boy, with everything he lived for, committed suicide. But the investigation included not allowing the local medical examiner to take pictures, Lennon having the wrong shoes on and those shoes not being there when the autopsy was done, and now a pathology report that says the physics don't work because his height and the height of the swing and the length of the belts that he supposedly put together and hang himself are basically a physical impossibility. And yet the system wants us to simply go away. And when you add this kind of racial discrimination in the justice system, and you add to it over-aggressive or policing, too many episodes of cops going crazy, the devaluation of black boys and black men, When you see the power given to a cop being abused, the power of a badge and a gun and the ability to walk in your house with a warrant and remove any member of your family is too much power for a bigot and a trigger-happy police person. And when you add to this the society laws in the criminal justice system, the taxes on the poor, the attacks on the sick, the attacks on immigrants, the attacks on the unemployed, and the attacks on public education in Ferguson and in North Carolina, it is clear that in some ways, America must indict herself. America must indict her own conscience, or at least those who are refusing to deal with these issues. And those of us who are black and brown and white who recognize that we can no longer push this stuff under the rug must declare that it's time for America, not just black America, but it's time for America to reach the verdict that we must deal with the continuing flaws of racial injustice in this country. America must do it. And this indictment must be taken under the perusal of the court of public opinion and in the halls of government. We must finally, Nancy, render the verdict that we have to deal with this problem and deal with it now. Amen. That's why the NAACP first stands with the family of Mike Brown and all the others in cities that have been victims. Don't forget, St. Louis is a place, Ferguson is a place where a man was falsely arrested, beaten, bled on an officer's uniform, and then was charged with destroying government property. That same place. Second, in NAACP, we have issued a guide to strategic responses to the situation in our nation with about 20 other civil rights organizations. We are calling for a federal investigation to still proceed. Early on, we asked for an independent special prosecutor, and the governor should have put one there. We believe that without national standards on the use of force by police, a national ban on racial profiling, and effective state and local laws against these practices, law officers are free to engage in unchecked racial profiling and violence, threatening the very communities they are sworn to protect. Racial profiling, when used by law enforcement, is a waste of resources and attention and an abuse of constitutional rights, and racial profiling does not protect the community. It actually makes that community more vulnerable because the lack of trust is bred when there is no transparency and there is no proper training and there's no proper enforcement. Rodney Sadler, one of my friends, said today, Nancy, it was not blind justice that ruled the day, but justice jaundiced by the colored lens of race that enabled this system yet again to devalue the loss of an African-American male's child's life. There is legitimate anger across the nation. It is not just anger against a white police officer who used such lenses as he looked at the black body of Mike Brown. It is anger against a system that, despite the evidence of bias seen in the killings of Trayvon Martin and Oscar Grant and Darian Hunt and Amaya Dillio and Jonathan Farrell and several other black men and women, can't seem to account for the injustice done in these instances, and to see that white male officers as guilty of doing anything wrong. Nothing. An unarmed boy was shot 7 times by an armed adult male officer, and no indictment was returned. The lenses aren't just jaundiced, they are jaded. And then Dr. Sadler said, until we deal with the real monster in the room, race, and we confront it, confess it, and repent of it systemically, we will never deal with this issue. So we are calling for mandatory training on racial violence police use of force. We're calling for required use of police officer body-worn cameras to recover every police-civilian encounter. We're calling for better accountability of the use and potential distribution of federal military weapons by law enforcement. What do you need all of that for? We are calling for greater oversight of police officers through the formation of the National Police Commission to create national standards. We are calling for true citizen review boards in communities across this country. And we're calling for it from the governor's office through the Congress all the way to the White House. We must deal with this as America. That is why on this Saturday, November the 29th, the NAACP, Rev Laws, others of us, members of our youth and college division, we will take a delegation to join the march that will be led by Dr. Cornell Brooks, our new president, a 120-mile march from Ferguson to Jefferson City. Not only to dramatize what is happening in Missouri, but what is happening across the nation. We as a delegation are planning to go there on the 28th and to be there for the start of the march with other members from across the state of North Carolina. And on the day of its conclusion, we plan to have a special time of solidarity with those who are going to fight for the transformation of America. And this issue, fairness in the criminal justice system, guaranteeing the right of equal protection under the law for black, brown, and poor white people, has, is, and will always be a major part of the Forward Together Moral Movement agenda. We cannot back up on this issue. Because what we see happening finally is an indictment of a system that too often wants to dismiss the evidence in both statistics and actual cases that proves that our theories about racial disparities in the criminal justice system are not fragments of people's imagination, but rooted in legitimate discontent. Now, we strongly disagree with those who promote violence to deal with violence because history teaches us it doesn't work. But as Dr. King would say, there is legitimate discontent. This is the time not so much to be mad, but to be angry. My grandmother used to say, and I learned in theology school, that mad can be a condition of insanity, but anger is a condition of mourning, deep grief. Blessed are they that mourn, Howard Thurman would say. Mourning there is a form of anger, because the word anger in French means and grief. It means that you hurt because of what you see. And you can no longer, if you believe in freedom, rest. Riots, Dr. King said, are often the voice of the unheard. So yes, we must stand against the violence, but we also must hear both the violence and the sincere nonviolent protest. We do not listen and agree with those who would tear up their own community and burn and ravage, but we must hear the pain of the voices, and particularly the nonviolent voices. Those young people down there, most of them, don't let anybody tell you, the majority of the kids and the others in Ferguson are engaged in nonviolence. I was there. They trained 600 young people in nonviolent civil disobedience. They will be heard. They are angry. We are too, for we are hurting. But we must listen. We cannot turn a deaf ear to what is being said, even if it's not always said exactly right. In forensic science, we are taught that wounds talk. They talk. That's how you find out who killed someone. In forensic science, certain wounds speak. If someone is stabbed in the gut, the wound tells you that that probably was somebody very close to that person that stabbed them, and they stabbed them in the gut to say, in essence, you hurt me deeply. Sometimes a head wound can mean that the person that committed that crime and engaged and perpetrated that wound is really saying, you didn't pay me in the mind. Wounds talk. And our nation is wounded. And the wounds are speaking. violence, but we must lift this too. Coretta Scott King says, when somebody asked her about violence and her husband being shot, she said, yes, that's one form of violence. She said, but there are other forms of violence. Poverty, she said, can produce the most deadly kind of violence. In this society, violence against poor people. She said, violence is starving a child. Violence is suppressing a culture. Violence is neglecting school children. Violence is discrimination against working people and denying them labor rights. Violence is ghetto housing. Violence is ignoring medical needs and health care. Violence is contempt for equality. And then she said something of violence that I don't ever want to commit. And she said there is a form of violence that is the lack of willpower to help humanity and the refusal to do anything about wrong. She said that too this is Coretta Scott King, a sick and sinister form of violence. So yes, we stand against the violence in the street and the burning, but we are also against the violence and the apathy of our political leaders, religious leaders, and anybody else that will not engage this issue. That's why all over America, we are hearing what was heard at the first Christmas. And maybe right for the show. Maybe our Christmas needs to be disturbed. Maybe we've become too cute and we forgot that there was a battle at Bethlehem. Maybe we've sung so many cute Christmas carols that we've forgotten that the first Christmas, the first was the sound of black and brown babies being killed by flawed judicial rulings of an insecure king called Herod that would use his power to engage in a form of racialized brutality. The first Christmas, the sound was not the sound of babies crying happily because they had gotten a good present under the tree. But black and brown babies were crying because they were being killed because of the orders from the NAACP. And then Matthew says that what Rachel did in Jeremiah, Rachel once again did on the first Christmas. And Matthew quotes, and the voice of Rachel is heard, crying and weeping in Ramah, refusing to be comforted. The first Christmas was filled with blood, the blood of the innocent. Rachel refusing to be comforted because her children were no more. I believe you're hearing Rachel. I believe the voice of Mike Brown's mama and dad, the voice of Trayvon's mama, the voice of people from California to Missouri, North Carolina to New York, is Rachel's voice once again in this Christmas season, crying. The marching is a form of Rachel's voice, crying. The young people at UNC today laying on the ground is a form of Rachel's voice, crying. But that voice is not feminine or masculine in the prophetic sense. It's the voice of prayer. It's a prophetic voice. It's a voice that says, I will not be comforted. I will not accept going to funeral after funeral and killing after killing. I will no longer accept it until America renders a verdict on herself and agrees in the court of consciousness that it's time to address the continuing inequality in our criminal justice system. And I would suggest, if you want to have a good Christmas God's way, we who claim to be God's people need to join Rachel. We don't need to let this season be covered over with tinsel, glitz. We need to join justice comes, until the breaches are repaired, until the terrible pain leads to the power of transformation, until we can say we are one nation under God with liberty and justice for all, and it not be full of hypocrisy and holes, until parents like me of young black boys don't have to worry about them being killed by the foolishness of gangs or the frightening possibility of police brutality and shooting. We cannot be comforted. Rachel is crying, refusing to be comforted because her children are no more. To be with God is to join Rachel and refuse to be comforted until everyone's humanity is respected and everyone's life is that. I wish you a morning